So the next thing we need to do is just start using Skeleton's grid classes to apply a grid to our page so that we can get it to behave responsively. Now we've already done a couple of things that Skeleton is going to make easier work of. So for example, we had set a max width of around 960 on our main element, and we also gave it margins equal to auto. If I examine that in my developer tools, we can see how that's being applied. And let's move here to the styles panel where you can see this. You see this max width of 960 and this margin of 0 and auto. Well, Skeleton has a single CSS class that applies both of those two properties without you having to do it manually. So let's take a look at what that would look like. If I come back to my main element here, and instead of applying those classes in my style sheet to the main element, if I give the main element a class equal to container, and if I come back here and I reload the page, we're going to see something different taking place here. You can see now we've talked a little bit about CSS specificity and how styles that are applied to what's called a type selector, or just the tag itself, are overridden by classes. So if you give something a class and you apply styles to the class name instead of to the tag itself, then that is given a slightly higher level in the hierarchy. And we can see that taking place here for Skeleton. And if we continue to scroll down and take a look at these styles that are being applied to the container class in Skeleton, we see those two properties that we had already added, right? We have max width of 960 and we have that margin of 0 and auto. Now if we continue down the chain here, we can see that our style sheet also has those, but by giving main a class of container, our styles are being overridden because the class has a higher degree of importance in our hierarchy than the type selector. So all that means, long story short, is that we can do something as we go here called refactoring our style sheet. And since we have already added that class of container, we can come back to our style sheet and simplify by doing one of two things. So generally what I would recommend is that we delete these because it reduces the file size of the style sheet. But since we're doing this for a class, just so that I can see that you did it, I'm going to ask you to comment them out. And that way I can see that you went through and you actually made some decisions as we were going about things that did not need to be in our style sheet anymore as a result of using Skeleton. It's not going to be very many things, by the way. Okay, so now that we do that, we can come back and we can see that our style sheet, hierarchy is just a little bit less cluttered because we took that out. Not much, but it's a good idea because it reduces the file size as we go. Okay, so now we can see that Skeleton is giving us that 960, but we can see a couple of things that it took away that were kind of important too, right? We have a few issues here that we want to resolve. So let's come back to our own style sheet for the main element here, and I'm going to come back to styles.css, and normalize probably is to blame for getting rid of some of the padding that's going on around here. So let's scroll down and see what we have here. So we should have 2 rims of padding all the way around, but for some reason that's not coming in right here. So let's see what's going on with that. Let's grab my little selector here, and I can see that my main element is not receiving that padding, and that is because Skeleton at line 47 of its CSS has set the padding of the container to 0. So all I need to do if I want to fix that is in my own style sheet, what I may want to do is just, if I wanted to keep these and I didn't want to have to deal with these overrides, is just go ahead and add that class of container to the main element. So I can do that in my style sheet by calling out main.container instead of just main. And that brings back everything that I had before, so it's still looking a little bit better. Obviously, we still need some responsive typography. We'll deal with that in just a little bit. But the next thing that I want to take care of has to do with the navigation bar here. I actually would like for the navigation bar to line up with that same center alignment that I have in the main element here, instead of the buttons going all the way to the edge of the page. So I'm going to fix that first. In order to do that, I have to fix it in my HTML. So for now, I'm going to do a quick save as on my style sheet and overwrite the one that's there. And then I'm going to come back to Sublime Text, and I'm going to do a couple of things to upfit the way that my header is behaving. So we've already learned that if we give something a class of container, it's going to give it that max width of 960 and margins auto on either side. But we have a pretty deep nesting of elements here for our header, so I'm actually going to work from the inside out here. And I know that I'm going to want to add column classes, some sort of column span to each list item so that they take up the amount of space that I need for them to take up. And if we look at the skeleton documentation, it's kind of hidden in here, but if you look right here where it's showing you how to set up rows and columns, it mentions that columns should always be the immediate child of a row. So if I'm going to give my list items a class that has something to do with columns, then that means the next thing above those list items, which would be the UL, needs to have a class of row. And then the container is the main centered wrapper. So I'm looking at a level of 3 as far as the nesting goes here. So what that means is my list items are going to be columns. So my unordered list needs a class equal to row in order to be able to contain columns. And then that means that my nav element is what would get the class equal to container. Now if I save that and take a look at what that does before I get too much further, let's go back and reload our page. And we can see now that our navigation buttons have kind of centered in the space here, and that this lines up nicely right here. And we can see that everything's looking pretty good. The problem is that it's not gonna stack yet, because that's what the columns do. So we need to come back and provide a column span for each of my list items. So I'm going to come back to my code, and I'm going to use the feature of Sublime that allows me to have more than one cursor by holding down Command and clicking at the beginning of each list item, and then hitting my space bar and typing class equals. And now here we're going to be pulling out two different classes, but adding them both to the same class attribute. You can only have one class attribute on any given HTML element, but it can have multiple values. So I can put more than one class name in each one of these. So what I'm going to do is add my cursors back, and I'm going to add the classes of 2 and then a space for columns. And what that's going to do is give me a 2-column span for each of my list items, but the problem is these all need to add up to 12. And right now I've only got 5 links in the top navigation, so this is only going to add up to 10. So I need to make one of these take up 4, or 2 of them take up 3, I suppose could work too. What I'm going to do is choose to give the extra weight to the resume download button here, just so that it'll call more attention to it. So I'm going to give it a class of 4 columns and each of the others a class of 2 columns. That will all together add up to equal 12. And then if I save my work, I can come back, reload my page, and I don't see a ton of change here other than my resume download button got bigger. And once I get below 500 pixels, now you can see here I've still got some work I need to do. You see how these are stacking up. So that's where I need to do some custom code. But once I get to 550, everything should be stacking. Let's see. But they are not. Oh, I know why. It's another thing that I need to refactor. Okay, so in order for us to have those take up an equal amount of space in our regular CSS, if you remember, we gave them all a width of 66.66%, or 16.66% in the footer, and then in the main navigation it's this 20% width. I bet if I comment that out, that I'll start to see the change that I need to see here. Nope. Okay, so the last thing that we need to look at is probably the culprit here. And that is this use of the display flex property on the navigation list here. So I'm going to comment that out. And now I can see they're stacking, but I can't see the rest of my buttons. And that is because we also gave it a fixed height using regular CSS. And that's right here. This header nav has a height of 40 pixels. So if I comment that out, then I can see my entire navigation bar. And I can see that if I resize, the navigation bar starting to look a little bit more correct. Now, of course, that did give me some issues to resolve. Like, I don't like this bit of margin or padding that's taking place on the bottom here. So we'll want to figure out where that's coming from. And we'll use that using the dev tools. And you notice when I hover over list items, we get that orange highlight on the bottom, which is margin. And if I select one, I can learn that there is a margin being applied on the bottom of one rim from skeleton. And it's being applied to list items in general. That's not a bad thing for the list items that are actually down here. But for my list items in my navigation bar, I don't really want them there. So I'm going to come back and come and find my NavUL-LI and make sure that I override that with a margin bottom of 0. And that's going to take care of that. Let's see if that's still working at responsive sizes. It is. And you notice we get this kind of a strange framing effect here that we might want to get rid of on the phone too, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Overall, right now, the navigation bar is looking really good, except for some responsive, some custom CSS we need to use at these middle device widths and on the responsive size as well. This might be something we want to get rid of and save all that real estate for the actual text on the page. But let's take care of our footer first. And what I want to do is challenge you before you watch the video next to try to code the footer yourself based on what we just did for the header navigation.